My name is Kathleen Martin, and I am the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. I am also an independent researcher, and I'm associated with the Mutual UFO Network as their Director of Experiencer Research, and the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. I'm on the board of directors, and I'm a research associate there as well. But I'm primarily an independent investigator and researcher and the author of 4 books, co-author of 4. And I was 13 years old when Betty Hill phoned my mother. My mother was Betty's younger sister, and she and my Uncle Barney had been on a brief vacation to Niagara Falls. They returned home through Montreal and through the White Mountains of New Hampshire to their home on the seacoast of New Hampshire, which is it's just a 17-mile seacoast, and they lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the previous evening, as they were returning home, Betty told my mother that she and Barney had seen a flying saucer, and they'd seen it very, very close. It was so close to them that they were concerned they might have been exposed to radiation, and they wanted to know what to do. They had taken very long showers. They had left their clothing out on the back porch. They had food with them, and they left their food in a cooler, and they were going to throw that away. They were very concerned. We had a neighbor who was a physicist, and my mother called the physicist. And for some reason, he said that if Betty had a compass, she should take it out to the car to see how the needle of the compass reacted to the car. Well, she did. And the compass needle would spin and spin, indicating that there were counter-rotating magnetic fields on the trunk of that vehicle. We have seen that in other cases of close contact with UFOs and abductions. As the story unfolded over the next couple of days, my family and I drove to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I had 2 younger brothers, mother and father, to Betty and Barney's home. And I was able to hear the story firsthand. Then I saw the spots on the trunk of the car. What I found out is that Betty and Barney had a sighting that lasted for probably about an hour. This UFO came in closer and closer as they drove along. They stopped a couple of times to look at it, and at one point it swooped down so low that they thought it was maybe 100 feet off the ground. And Barney stepped out of the car. He left the car running. Betty was seated in the passenger seat. He looked up through binoculars at this craft, and he saw lighted windows. And behind those windows, he saw figures looking down at him. It moved to an adjacent field, and he followed the craft into the field, and it descended even lower. As he was looking, all but one of those figures that he described as being somehow non-human, but dressed in shiny black uniforms, all but one moved away from the windows and went to a panel on the back side of this corridor. And when they did, he could see them from their knees all the way to the tops of their heads. He saw their arms go up into the air, and when that happened, fin-like structures started to come out of the sides of this craft. There were red lights on the ends of these fins, and the UFO tipped toward him and started to descend lower. Something started to drop down out of the bottom of this craft. He was greatly distressed and frightened, thinking that they were going to capture him. He ran back to the car, screaming to Betty they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. And as he was running back, he saw this craft move again. He believed it was going to be over the top of the car. So as he went speeding down the highway, he said to Betty, "Roll down your window and look up. See if you can see them." She did. She was expecting to see lights. She didn't see the lights on the craft All she saw was blackness. And then she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds that appeared to be striking the trunk of their vehicle in the area where they found these counter-rotating magnetic fields, where their compass needles would spin and spin the following day. And then something happened. They felt a vibration in their vehicle. They felt a tingling sensation pass through their bodies. And the next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway with almost no memory of what had happened in the interim. They remembered that somewhere along the way they encountered a roadblock. They didn't know where or when that occurred. They had a need for human contact. They wanted to find the state police or any patrolman who might be out so they could report this immediately. They heard a second series of buzzing sounds on the trunk of the car. At that point, Barney stopped the car. He shifted the car from side to side on the road, trying to reproduce that sound. He could not do that. Betty looked up again. She didn't see a UFO that time. They drove home. And when they arrived home, it was a couple of hours later than they had anticipated. And that is when they found evidence that something extraordinary had happened to them, something they couldn't remember. Betty's dress was torn in several locations. There was a 2-inch tear in the stitching on the zipper at the back of her dress. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. Her hem was torn down on one side. The lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline. Barney's best dress shoes, and he was a meticulous dresser, his best dress shoes were so deeply scraped he had to go out and buy new shoes and wore them for yard work after that. The binocular strap that he had around his neck as he was standing in that field had broken. It was a leather strap, and it was severed, as I imagine, because he pulled those binoculars down from his eyes so violently as he was attempting to escape from the eyes of that individual who was standing at the window looking down at him, who so greatly frightened him. The watches they were wearing that night had stopped and never ran again. There was a lot of evidence that something very perplexing had happened, but they had no memory for what had happened during that 2-hour period of missing time. They remembered the UFO. Barney remembered observing the non-humans on board that craft. They remembered the second series of buzzing sounds. It's all in the early reports that they made to the Air Force, Project Blue Book, and also to NICAP. But Barney left out the part about observing non-humans on the craft because he was afraid of ridicule. He thought the Air Force would think he was crazy. So he left that out. But he didn't leave that out when he made the report to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And they found that committee because Betty checked the first book she had ever read on that subject out of the Portsmouth Public Library a couple of days after they arrived home. And she read that book, and the address was in that book. And that's why she and Barney wrote their letter and their report to NICAP. It was an incredible story. They underwent hypnosis a couple of years later. And initially, they wanted Barney to undergo hypnosis because he knew those figures were somehow not human. He could describe the uniform. He even could describe a facial expression. But he did not remember all the details of their faces. And they had that period of missing time. And they thought that he developed a mental block after he had observed those non-humans and felt so threatened by them. And it took them a couple of years to find a psychiatrist, a renowned psychiatrist, in fact, who was highly competent in using deep trance hypnosis in order to help people to overcome psychosomatic symptoms that they were experiencing as the result of an intense emotional experience. Dr. Benjamin Simon had had a great deal of success in working with veterans returning from World War II who couldn't go back into society because their experiences in the war were so traumatic that they might have been blinded even though there wasn't a physiological reason for that blinding, or they might have been crippled and unable to walk because of the psychological effect of the experience they had. Dr. Simon said that Barney's trauma was as great as any shell shock victim that he ever treated. Barney feared for his death, for his life. This was an experience that was very traumatic for him. And Dr. Simon worked with both Barney and Betty separately for a period of 6 months. He hypnotized each of them and he did therapy with each of them. He induced amnesia at the end of each of their individual sessions for 2 reasons. One reason was the trauma was so great that it could have caused further emotional damage to them, particularly to Barney, if they remembered all of that at one time. And for the second reason, it was because he didn't want them to share the details of their experience with one another. And that is very important because I was able to compare their separate statements to Dr. Simon, line up those statements for comparative analysis to discover whether Betty's and Barney's statements correlated in detail. And I found out that they did, and I also compared those statements to 5 dreams that Betty had had and had written down in 1961. And what I found was that Betty's and Barney's statements about what happened on that craft and as they were abducted matched, but they did not match Betty's dream material in detail in all cases. So that led me to believe that this was indeed a true experience, and there was a tremendous amount of physical evidence as well that has been investigated scientifically. Chemical analysis has been done on Betty's dress with anomalous findings in 5 different laboratories. There's a tremendous amount of physical evidence here. Betty and Barney were credible individuals. She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. He had served honorably in the Army during World War II. His release papers say that he was of excellent character. They were church-going people. They were very involved in community affairs. In fact, in 1965, Barney was appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee in the state of New Hampshire. He was also given a commendation by Sergeant Shriver for the good work he had done in Portsmouth, New Hampshire through the Office of Economic Opportunity, setting up the Rockingham County Community Action Program, and he was the first chairman of the board of directors for that committee. And Betty worked at his side. They worked as a couple together, doing these good things for the people of this country. In the civil rights movement, they were an interracial couple. And for the people of New Hampshire, they worked on voters' rights during the time when people had to pass a literacy test in order to vote. And they worked on that literacy program so that everyone who wanted to vote would have that opportunity. The 3 of us were invited guests at Lyndon Johnson's inauguration, and we went to that inauguration together. So what I'm saying is they were credible. There was scientific evidence. There was missing time. These were not emotionally unstable individuals. It was only the experience itself. No one that we knew of had had that experience before them. They feared for their life when this occurred.